So hi Bill, it's a real pleasure to have you here early in the morning from Atlanta, and I hope you are fine and all the family members are also fine. So thanks for accepting this. And I wanted to connect with you actually to understand your thoughts on the changing scenario in the world. How do you see it? What are your perspectives?
Sure. Well, it's great to see you again too, and thank you for the chance to think about some things which are probably on the top of mind for a lot of us. And I did spend a little walking time reflecting on on this today. It was actually very interesting because we most of us have never lived through something like this before. Certainly with with the scale and scope of this globally. And one of my first thoughts always goes back to supply chain, having worked in procurement for many years. And I think for procurement leaders, our world's going to be very different going forward, and we all sense that, and we don't know exactly what that means, but it's probably going to be divided into two groups of procurement leaders. There are going to be those industries where they're going to be mandated changes, and other industries where it'll be more discretionary changes. Discretionary from the sense that this is what their company wants to do. They're not going to be mandated by a government group. But for the group that's in the mandated class, and that's going to expand as well. It used to be, from a U.S. perspective, companies which participated in strategic defense and things like that, Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, the companies that come to mind, they're accustomed to restrictions on their supply chain. But the net on that's going to be broadened. For instance, healthcare and products that supply healthcare, I think are now going to be cast into that broader mandated supply chain, and that'll probably mean a lot more domestic production of products for that group. And even on the discretionary group, I think they're going to have to relook at this and certainly broaden their sourcing capability, understand where the bottlenecks are. And it's probably going to go into, this is going to be extremely complex, and it probably needs to be digitally enabled. You just can't do this on a spreadsheet, nor can you model it with the speed and accuracy they're going to need to do it in the future. And the final point on that is, look, you can be assured that once we flip this switch, that we'll flip it again. Politicians, the next time they see the potential for a national pandemic, will pull this switch again, out of best interests for the people and probably for their own personal reelection, so that they're not criticized. But I think it's highly likely we will see this again in the future. So I don't think it's being done for an event that we won't likely have to face again.
I agree. I agree. And just taking a cue from what you just said on the technology piece, would you share something more on the technology piece? What you just shared?
Yeah, I think technology can be used for a couple of purposes. One is to identify what are those critical elements of your supply chain, products, services, whatever, which are vulnerable and can shut you down. Being in the Coca-Cola business, we're all accustomed to the term no bubbles, big troubles. If we don't get CO2, we don't run our business. So we've been living in that world for a long time.
Absolutely.
But there's a lot more than that. And, it goes much deeper into our supply chain, into the molecules that we use to run our, to put together our business. And we're going to have to identify that. We're going to have to be able to model it and be able to identify alternative sources faster if we want to, effectively deal with this in the future. So I think you're going to have to rely upon it, and it's not a spreadsheet either. It's going to have to be, and there are supply chain platforms out there that allow us to do that.
Right. So any key initiatives that the supply chain procurement fraternity should immediately adopt?
Well, I think, for the time being, I think it's really going to, it's a matter of just getting through this crisis, because we haven't learned all the lessons yet. So I would say hold that question for another 6 months, because what we're going through has not completely evolved. And the best way to answer that question is to look back in 6 months and say, okay, what did we learn and what can we do differently? I do think it's going to change procurement priorities. It's a little bit off track, but for instance, sustainability has been hugely front of mind for procurement people, and rightfully so. Sustainability is good. It's going to be a mix. This pandemic is going to be a mixed bag for sustainability. On one hand, it gives us a glimpse into what the world would look like if we cut back on transportation and manufacturing emissions, because so much transportation has slowed down, or in many cases stopped. Manufacturing has slowed down and in many cases stopped. And we all have seen the global pictures of what the world looks like, and it's a much less pollution-free place. But I think what's going to happen too, in the eyes of the consumer, is safety and security are going to be front of mind for the foreseeable future. So it's going to actually push sustainability initiatives to the background for a period of time. Not forever, but it's hard to say, 6 months or a year. I think we're going to be very focused on this for that time period.
I agree. Do you think that the leadership roles will also evolve, and one should adopt and look for some new ways of working, and how should one look at the next 2 years, 3 years from now on?
Well, we've in procurement have always had a very distributed team. We work together. We work together on between Atlanta and India in the BIG group. We worked as part of a larger group, the CEPG group. So, the whole ability to work together on a distributed and digitally enabled team is something we've been using for a long, long time. I think we need to get much closer connectivity with our supply base as well. We need to include them in that work team in a way that we haven't maybe felt the need in the past. Being able to connect with them, because they're going to face some of the same kind of restrictions. So we're going to expand the work practices we've used internally, I think, to external groups as well. That's one thing.
Very important.
And ensure that those suppliers are able to do that. The second thing I think is, stay calm. And it might seem kind of strange, but having a level, clear point of view of things that you want to do and know you need to do, well thought out ahead of time, is the recipe for the next crisis. And we're going to have to, at procurement, plan for these things. I spent 30 years and never really saw something like this. not exactly like this. We've seen shortages, oil shortages and things like that, CO2 shortages. But like I said earlier, you're going to see this again. This lever, whatever you want to call it, will be flipped again. And so we need to be thinking. And the other thing is, oil used to be the big bottleneck. If we didn't have oil, the global commerce stopped. Well, oil's not that way anymore, but the new oil is going to be those kinds of commodities like rare earth metals and things like that people haven't considered in the past, but they will need to be considered in the future. Now, for our business, that rare earth doesn't matter, but we do have those types of ingredients or supplies that we need to consider. So, I would say we've got to have plans ahead of time that have been produced with the input of a global team.
I agree. I agree. So, Bob, what could be one or two best practices which the US team is adopting these days, which one should probably consider in their own countries and in their own markets? How do you spell that out?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the things I would say is that your contracts should anticipate this. And we have always encouraged contracts to be written, for instance, with a clause that gives you preferential rights to supply.
Right.
The challenge with that is legally that gets into some difficult areas in some countries, and I think India is maybe one of those. But nonetheless, I think that we all need to give additional thought to those contracts and the expectations of our suppliers. And maybe they don't go so far as to say, you will guarantee my supply to the exclusion of others. I understand how that can be problematic. But here's the thing. If you're relying upon a supplier for a large portion of your materials and goods, there are certain things you can expect of them. One is, have they gone through the same due diligence that you have? In other words, if you have a supplier who has 4 manufacturing locations globally distributed, that's great. But have they gone to the next level and said, oh, but all of our key materials come from China or some other country where this could happen again? So you have expectations that they have done the same due diligence on their supply planning that you're doing in your own organization. And I don't think we've ever gone that far that quickly in terms of, or that deeply, I should say. Yeah. The other thing I would tell you is what we've done globally, and certainly in the United States, there's a $3 trillion package to fix this. That's $3 trillion on a $20 trillion budget, 21. That's extremely inflationary.
Sure.
And I think what you're going to see coming out of this soon is you're going to start to see inflation reemerge in 2021. And it's time to dust off your commodity risk management, which we've always been very good at. But I think commodities are the thing that will be impacted when we start to see inflation. And so I would say to the team, if you haven't, commodities have taken a back seat because prices have been so low for so long. Don't get lured into a sense of complacency, because there is a super cycle coming. It's generally triggered by inflation. And what we're seeing, when you pay $3 trillion, for example, in the United States, that $3 trillion did nothing to increase productivity.
I know.
So there's no productivity coming out of that. which that by definition will generate inflation. So be prepared. Those would be my words of advice. As well as looking into some digital practices that you don't have yet. And it doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to be all encompassing, but take some baby steps towards being able to model your supply chain, especially the critical materials. Be prepared when you get invited to the C-suite. Be prepared with this in hand, because it will show a level of professionalism on you personally that will be well for your career.
No, yes, absolutely, extremely valid point. And I just want to also like to have your views on the supplier fraternity, because now they will also approach you with various requests. Could be early payments, could be delayed delivery. So how to address, because everybody, you are also expecting some favors
Right.
because of the situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, um, I think this is this is one of those times where what you do and how you act will be remembered for a long, long time. I'll say again, what you do and how you act will be remembered for a long time. And so I would say now is not the time to dig in over things that are really dig into your entrenched position over things that are not important. Now is the time to be as flexible, and I'd even say generous as possible, to help your supply base, knowing that because a small favor can go a long way in the future. Now, there are things that they may ask for you just can't do, and that has to be explained. But there are things you can do, and to the extent that your own organization is well financed cash wise, maybe you need to loosen those standards for a while, because we all know that small businesses, especially, are the ones who are the hardest hit from a financing perspective. So I would be, if I were still the CPO, I would be very open to using this opportunity within reason to build relationships for a stronger future.
Right. So
Some of
wonderful.
the people who hear this who know me maybe say I'm getting soft, but there's a much more strategic purpose behind this.
So this is the time to be supportive, actually.
Right. As
Either way.
within reason, yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So thanks, Bill. Really appreciate your time today. And I think everybody will get benefit of whatever thoughts you have shared. And I would like to connect you soon. Stay safe and really appreciate your time.
And likewise, please stay safe, you and all of the great associates that are working in our business in India and elsewhere. Thank you. Goodbye.